First week of triple digits, 103 degrees on Friday. You all feeling that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So strap in. Sacramento gets even more interesting. I want to start off a little bit this morning with a reflection. Have you heard this phrase, know thyself? Have you heard that phrase? All right, so this is a common Greek axiom. It was initially inscribed in the temple of Apollo. And originally it means something more like know your soul. Right? So the word there is psyche, which transliterated is psyche. Right? And that means know your mind, your inclination, orientation, perspective. And there's even a classic psychology textbook on this, Nate, called Psychology in Search of Its Soul. It's kind of playing on these two different things. Another great classic in psychology is a book by Viktor Frankl called Man's Search for Meaning. And Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychotherapist and Holocaust survivor. He chronicled his experience as a prisoner in a Nazi concentration camp, and that experience later became the basis for his unique approach to psychotherapy, which we call, or refer to as logos therapy. And in Frankl's approach, he attempted to know thyself, right? This kind of common theme, by identifying a person's purpose through three different means. And those three means are the completion of tasks with integrity, finding meaning by facing suffering with dignity, and lastly, caring for another person. So, completion of tasks with integrity, finding meaning by facing suffering with dignity, and caring for another person. Now, if you think about it, every great story or song really unpacks this theme of know thyself. Right? This is what makes for every great song, story, movie. And what you'll also notice is that Frankl was onto something here, because every great song, story, or movie unpacks the know thyself through these three different avenues. Again, those avenues are completing tasks with integrity, finding meaning by facing suffering with dignity, and caring for another person. So I wanted to see, like, hey, was I on to something here? Have I picked up on something? Know thyself in these three different ways of looking at something, of analyzing something. So it's like, okay, let's do a test case. And it's like, oh, I know what I can do. And I looked up The Ugly Duckling. Remember this one? This classic children's tale. And sure enough, those three means for assessing know thyself showed up, but they're in different ways. And so The Ugly Duckling is a story about asking, who am I? You know, who am I becoming? What am I to do? And how do I endure scrutiny? How do I endure suffering? And in The Ugly Duckling, it's in terms of scrutiny. So it's also worthwhile here to look at, and we have several literature people in here, we have a teacher of literature, right? So also look at a story through the lens of what it's not saying. Okay? So here, The Ugly Duckling lacks Frankl's third component. It really doesn't unpack caring for another person. It doesn't really have that piece to it. So if you actually look at that kind of matrix for assessing modern literature, modern self-help guides, and popular psychology, you'll find a common theme. Across the board, most of them are missing this thing of caring for another person. is happening here? And what you'll see is, and what I surmise, is that culture is stuck in an isolating loop of self-assessment, right? It assesses everything through kind of terms of ability, inability, right? Defective or perfect, loser or winner, unacceptable or acceptable, victim or victor. Everything is kind of this bifurcated either or sort of scenario based upon perfection in performance and whether or not that makes someone valuable. I want to engage this from our text today. I want to look at our text, and I'm going to propose two interrelated components for self-understanding that can break us out of that isolating loop. Does that make sense? Okay. And so those two components that we're going to look at, and these kind of, they're two interrelated propositions. One is there's freedom in embracing one's limitations. Freedom in embracing one's limitations. And two, since human beings are the most social of all creatures, we are best understood in exchange with another, with the most self-understanding coming from what God says about us and our potential as members of a healthy Christian fellowship. So, all that's really important. Set that aside, hold on to it, cue it up, have it away to look at the rest of our comments here. The second Sunday of this past February, we explored the idea of spiritual myopia. Do you remember this? From 2 Corinthians 4. We reflected on the nature of spiritual nearsightedness from living in an age of egoism. As you know, I'm going to get us caught up with the first part of 2 Corinthians 4 here. Paul the Apostle wrote 2 Corinthians around 55 AD, only a year or two after he wrote 1 Corinthians. Paul knew the Corinthians well and actually wrote them several times. The Corinthians could be quite the reprobates. I remember my grandma growing up used to say, "You're a Corinthian." Right? You know, Nazarene lady. I didn't quite know what that meant until later on. I think she was right. I was a Corinthian. Paul made an in-person visit to the Corinthians after he wrote 1 Corinthians, and this visit didn't quite go so well. In fact, later on he talks about it as a visit of tears. So in 2 Corinthians, Paul writes them again in an attempt to instruct and reconcile with them. And this is why he launched into his long list of apostolic qualifications. We see this in chapter 4, verse 11 to 12, chapter 6, verses 3 through 10, and chapter 11. And he also spent a lot of time distinguishing his preaching from other more popular preachers. So this is kind of what's going on when Paul wrote to the Corinthians in such a way that comes across a little bit snarky in verse 3. And as you all know, snarkiness is not wasted on me. I mean, maybe this connects back to when my grandmother called me a Corinthian, I don't know. But, so he uses the word veiled when he talks to them. He describes the perception of some of the Corinthian readers as veiled. Now, what veiled means here is it's something that's hard to perceive. It's obtuse. It's challenging to discern. And so Paul was zinging the Corinthians. It was not only that the Corinthians didn't see, but they were unwilling to see. They were stubborn. Written today, verse 3 might read something like, "You better check yourself, Corinthians, because if you can't recognize the authenticity of our message, that says something about the authenticity of your faith." So he's going after him here. Then in 4:4, he writes this phrase, God of this age. And if you remember right, when we talked about that in 2 Corinthians 4 in February, we explained that this was behind why the gospel was veiled to some of the Corinthian readers. God of this age, particularly age means era, period of time, or epic, right? God of this age was this way of Paul likening the period of time to the book of Judges. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Paul's meaning here is similar in the sense of the modern concept of the spirit of the age. The Germans call this the Zeitgeist. And this is the idea that society is identified through its particular communication, right? Its particular form of culture, behavior, moral, and intellectual patterns, and how that affects communication in that context. So in short, what Paul is doing is he's saying the God of this age is that you guys live in an age of idolatry and you idolize idolatry. You're the idolaters that are idolaters because you idolize self in idolizing idolatry. Does that make sense? So, in many ways, Paul is kind of a predecessor to what St. Augustine would later pick up on when he wrote, I'm thinking of that quote from the Confessions, the blindness of humanity is so great that people are actually proud of their own blindness. And so that's kind of the idea that Paul is getting in here. This, you guys are so entrenched in this, and so enamored with your idolizing idolatry. That is a tongue twister. Say that 5 times fast. That you're blind to it, and you revel in your blindness. So Paul wanted to provide the Corinthians with a new orientation. And that is, he says, you guys need some illumination. And he wrote in 4:6 that authentic illumination comes from God, who said, and I quote, "Let light shine out of darkness. It has shone in your hearts to give the light of knowledge of God's glory in the face of Jesus Christ." So here Paul instructed Corinthian readers that answers to life's big questions comes only from Christ. His illumination would make them sober. It would clear their minds. It would help them perceive reality correctly. Only in view of Christ can they have light to see the everyday. So recall from this passage, we also took 4 literary allusions for how God gives light. And so one, we saw the creation narrative, Genesis 1, Paul's own conversion story to Damascus, the Shekinah glory, which connects back to 3:7, 2 Corinthians 3:7, and Jesus as the incarnation of God himself. No longer did people have to avert their eyes when God was present, like in the Old Testament, but they could look on God's eyes when they looked into the face of Jesus without any fear. So verses 1 through 6 here, Paul exhorted the Corinthians to become clear and sober-minded, and this came only through understanding themselves in view of Christ and Christ's purpose for their life. So now we're all caught up with those first 6 verses. Okay? Thanks for hanging in there. That was a lot to communicate. Now Paul comes to verse 7. And I love this text. We're going to actually zero in on this text here today. He says this, "Now we have this treasure in clay jars, so that this extraordinary power may be from God and not from us." Now we have this treasure in clay jars, so that this extraordinary power may be from God and not from us. So Paul continued instructing the Corinthians by telling them to see themselves as clay jars, or literally from the Greek, earthen vessels filled with treasure. Wow. Wow. Sometimes I look at comments like this from Paul, and I'm impressed with his goal. And then, on the other hand, I'm kind of perplexed by his nerve. And I wonder sometimes, did this guy keep many friends around? I mean, how do you approximate yourself? I'm supposed to be like a clay jar? You just ripped me, the first 6 verses, and you're trying to reconcile it. So I'm still waiting on that message here. However, if you pay close attention to what's going on in context, right, this clay jars analogy is actually a turn from zinging the Corinthians to encouraging them. So stick with me, let me explain why. You see, in verses 1 through 6, a clay jar containing treasure means that the Corinthians were no longer relegated to the God of their age. No longer were they subject to being lost in the idolizing of idolatry. No longer were they stuck in a self-replicating, isolating loop filled with the doctrines of a society that was estranged. Instead, it was now by recognizing their given purpose as stewards of a priceless treasure were they freed to life. Knowing the truth of Christ was the Corinthians' liberation from bondage. They were no longer ensnared, but set free. You see, liberation here is actually a very interesting paradox. To understand the liberation from the analogy of clay jars, we need to look at verse 5. And this is going to take some goal of our own. Right? Verse 5 says this interesting phrase, slaves because of Jesus. Now, the Greek word here, slave, in verse 5, doulos, means both slave and bondservant. Some scholars suggest that this word only meant bondservant in New Testament times. This suggestion is often short-sighted, and it's kind of an effort to avoid the interpretive entanglement that comes with the history and concept of slavery. So there might be some point to that. There might be this issue that primarily doulos, attested in that time as meaning bondservant. Many in the ancient Roman Empire were so indebted that they had to work off their freedom. However, make no mistake about this, the semantic range of doulos most certainly includes slavery. The Roman Empire were dealers in death and dealers in the human slave trade, right? They bought and sold people and treated people as property, not as human beings. Absolutely despicable in every sense of the word and term that we know denoted in slavery. Okay? So that is a really short-sighted interpretation of how people try to explain that away. We need to understand, however, that Paul's use of this term does not authorize or justify slavery on any account. One should not read Paul's analogical use that he, or Christianity in general, thinks slavery is okay, or contextual, or something that just a culture does. Rather, like all evil that human beings encounter in the world, God accommodates the human condition. That is, he works with us despite our circumstances. God gets down in the trenches of a broken world to rescue us from brokenness. To put it succinctly, accommodation is not authorization, but redemption. Accommodation is not authorization, but redemption. So case in point, the cross. Heinous and deplorable from all perspectives. Christ's good news of restored relationship with God and freedom from burdensome religion attests in his commitment to suffer a grotesque death. He brought all creation new meaning by facing suffering with dignity of his mission. Does that sound a little familiar? The point, no matter what suffering evil wants to conjure, no matter what wrong we participate in, God will always pursue the redemption of his creation because he's a loving, redeeming God. So to be clear, suggesting the text's analogical use of slavery justifying slavery is a complete and utter distortion of the text and God's heart and the gospel as shown through Christ. Groups like the New Atheists, moral libertarians, literal fundamentalists, and secular humanists have perpetuated this absurd notion. It's interesting to note the common thing among all these groups is the spirit of their modern age, and that is modern egoism. Anyway, I digress. Quite the opposite is going on here with the text's analogical use of the word doulos, slave. Christ's kingdom is for all people, regardless of present social status. It is a coming kingdom where there will be no more death, no more suffering, no more sin. Christ will wipe away every tear. There is no subjugation of any type in Christ's kingdom. Rightly understood, Christ is the greatest humanist who has ever lived. Elsewhere in the New Testament, when teaching about church's inheritance, and I'm sorry guys, you might detect that I get a little fired up about this issue. This is the right issue to get fired up about, right? The rest of the New Testament text unpacks this. In fact, we see it in Galatians 3:28. There is no Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, for you all are one in Christ Jesus, and if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed according to the promise. Right? The only kind of grandeur that happens in Christ's kingdom is who serves the other people the best. The greatest is the greatest servant. So Paul's analogical use of slave is to make a point. He's getting down and dirty using a very, very, very loaded term with a lot of pain and suffering in order to deliver the message of salvation. This thing goes deep. Right? It gives salvation to the very essence of human nature. It connects to 1 Corinthians 6:20. For you're bought at a price, therefore glorify God in your body. So doulos is about the Corinthians' self-understanding and view of the irresistible message that God had liberated them from the spirit of the age. Inspired by freedom they found in Christ, the Corinthians could not help but to oblige themselves to it. They were freed from self-ensnarement by embracing God's initiative of a relationship with Christ. Now here I should also note that Paul is very careful to not directly connect the word doulos to God as the object of any kind of sentence. Instead, Paul's use was hyperbolic to magnify the sense of the devotion to the gospel because of the freedom found in the gospel. That's the paradox. God is personal. God does not deal in terms of distorted power, objectification, and condemnation. Rather, God deals in terms of genuine love, thriving in deliverance from distorted power, objectification, and condemnation. This is precisely the analogy of what treasures in jars of clay is signifying. The analogy reflects the effect of the gospel on an otherwise wayward life and community. Knowing Christ brings life where there was only a shadow of it beforehand. We talk a lot about the inbreaking of God's kingdom into the world. We live it in our daily lives. Paul talked about it. The first place where the kingdom takes root, one's perceiving of perception of him or herself and the world through loving Christ, being in covenant relationship with Christ, and therefore in covenant relationship with all who follow Christ. Paul juxtaposed the wallowing death sentence of being ensnared by the present spirit of the age to the freedom and promised future of Christ with our brothers and sisters in tow. Instead of drowning in the emptiness of a society that reveled in idolatry, Paul wrote that God's life-creating and sustaining word, who makes the light shine out of darkness, would forever change the lives of the Corinthians, if they would only allow Christ's kingdom to shape their affections. Their simple, banal lives, aka clay pots, could be filled with treasure. So just a chapter later, if they were to allow this to happen, this is why Paul writes in 5:17, if anyone is in Christ, he or she is a new creation. Old things have gone and new things have come. This had shown up in Paul's own life, in his own conversion, turning from murderer and oppressor to nurturer and father of the church. Now listen again at the way in which verse 7 is written, and pay particular attention to how it addresses scope. Now we have this treasure in clay jars, so that this extraordinary power may be from God and not from us. God's ability to bring meaning to a broken life. That's what it's talking about. God does not cause confusion, suffering, and disillusionment. Rather, God brings meaning to a life of confusion, suffering, and disillusionment. God orders the path of all who love him and who are called according to his purpose, which he says in Romans 8:28. It is for this precise reason that Paul then goes on in this context in verses 8 through 9 to say, we are pressed in every way, but not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. We are persecuted, but not abandoned. We are struck down, but not destroyed. So you may find yourself asking, how do I apply this text? I'm getting really excited about it. How do I apply it? We often overestimate ourselves. We live in a culture where we're in a cycle of this. We almost have to prop ourselves up to survive. We need to actively appropriate the encouragement of this metaphor, jars of clay. Some considerations. A treasure contained in a clay jar might be an unsettling metaphor, especially to a people that are used to getting beat down all the time. And especially for, if I think about it, some theological approaches in the past that try to say that people are worse than maggots and they're worse than dirt. That's not what Paul is doing here. Rather, one should think of treasure, right, as something so valuable that you would think it's put in a container that is impermeable, that is permanent, that it is maybe ordained itself. But that's precisely the opposite of the nature that the treasure Paul is talking about. The point of this text is to point to the treasure, the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is housed in containers that will inevitably crack, crumble, and ultimately no longer exist. This is why the gospel is good news. It is treasure for the frail. In the text, Paul identified what will actually cause the clay jars to crack: affliction, persecution, and ultimately death. However, in verses 16 through 18, he says this: we do not give up, for our momentary light affliction is producing for us an absolutely incomparable, eternal weight of glory. So we do not focus on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Embrace being the clay jar and find purpose that you would not otherwise have. It is in this act of thoughtful submission you will have unparalleled clarity. Properly understanding the Christian faith not only acknowledges that life is not without its perils, but is to approach life completely honest and sober in view of your limitations. This fulfills two of Frankel's components: the completion of tasks with integrity, and two, finding meaning through facing suffering, aka enduring with dignity. It is not by numbing life, but by doing life with integrity, eyes wide open, that a full sense of meaning and dignity can be found. As Paul explained, we will be pressed at every point, but not hemmed in, persecuted by men, but never abandoned by God, at our wits' end, but never at hope's end, knocked down, but not knocked out. To know thyself truly necessitates looking past the empty, noisy promises of an egoist culture to refocus on the face and light present in Jesus. The light of Jesus' face can light your own life. You no longer have to stay puffed up, affixed on, and drawing self-understanding from the very thing that continually breaks down. Instead, through relationship with Christ and fellowship in his name, Frankel's third component, that is relationship, you may engage life fully. This is a relationship of complete honesty and vulnerability. Fellowship in his name should be done in the same way. You can now admit that sometimes you get tired. It is now possible and safe to gain a healthy self-understanding from your weaknesses and limitations. 2 Corinthians 12:9, the Lord said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. I like the King James translation of that. In my weaknesses, he is made strong. Embrace being a clay jar. It brings peace and frees you for joy because it releases you from having to puff yourself up and play by the rules of a culture of scarcity and competition. It is a movement into honesty, and it is in honesty that life is found full of dignity through relationship to the one who never grows tired or weary. Isaiah 40:28. Yes, we are weak, cracked, and less than perfect. Yet this acknowledgement is one of gratitude. It is the basis for new life that we find as a container of priceless treasure. To embrace being a clay jar is to open to the possibility of a fully redeemed life that includes honor, dignity, and completeness, and relationship with God through Christ and in fellowship of his name. Fully known, fully loved, and no fear of rejection. The gospel is not meant to be locked away. It is a treasure of good news about God's kingdom. It is not meant to be kept quiet, but communicated loudly by all befitting means. The gospel is a priceless investment in the recreation of humanity. It is an announcement that, given its full weight, would metaphorically break Wall Street. It is its own economy. The more it is given, the more it returns with compounded interest. So today I want to do something a little bit different, a little smaller today. Before we end, and instead of talking in small groups, I want to talk and just engage you guys as a group. One of you, I preach, but we're talking together. What comes to mind? Does somebody have something to share about an insight to embracing the idea of being a clay jar?